The way my parents parented was very much like, we don't fight around the kids. We don't ever say anything around them. There was no, we didn't know anything.
Riley Keough has spent years living under the shadow of her legendary family, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment she came face to face with Bob Joyce. The encounter was brief, yet her reaction immediately caught attention. Was it recognition, disbelief, or something more personal? Cameras captured the moment, but they couldn't explain what was happening behind her expression. And then, Riley appeared to realize something nobody expected. A claim that shook the internet this year. Earlier this year, a story began spreading across social media that made even longtime Presley family followers stop scrolling and go quiet for a second. It showed the moment actress Riley Keough, the real granddaughter of Elvis Presley, had come face to face with a gospel pastor named Bob Joyce, a man that large corners of the internet already believed to be Elvis himself, hiding in plain sight for almost 50 years. According to the accounts that spread online, the encounter turned emotional fast, and Keough was said to have reacted in a way that left everyone around her stunned into silence. Some versions of the story went even further, claiming she whispered a handful of words that would rewrite one of the most documented deaths in music history.
I think this is the first time she's ever talked in detail about his death. In the book, and she said goodnight to him.
Screenshots, short clips, and breathless captions moved from account to account within days, and each new version somehow added a detail the last one never mentioned. If you have followed celebrity news for any length of time, you already know how this feels. A story lands, it spreads faster than anyone can check it, and by the time you look closer, half the internet has already decided it is true. A famous family that rarely opens up, a decades-old mystery about a man the world says is gone, and a moment supposedly caught on camera by someone who happened to be standing in the right place at exactly the right time, which, if you think about it for even a moment, is already a fairly convenient coincidence on its own. But the way this story kept shifting and growing as it traveled should have been the first warning sign. What actually happened between these two people turns out to be far stranger than the version that went viral, and it starts long before Riley Keough ever entered the picture. The pastor behind the pulpit. To understand why this claim spread so fast, you have to understand who Bob Joyce actually is, and why his voice has been unsettling people online for the last 2 years. Joyce leads a small congregation called Household of Faith in Benton, Arkansas, where he preaches most Sundays and closes his service the same way he always has, with a hymn. It was one of those hymns, recorded on someone's phone without much thought and uploaded almost as an afterthought, that changed everything for him. The moment his voice dropped into a certain low register, something about it sounded uncannily familiar to anyone who grew up with Presley records playing in the house. Not similar in a vague, maybe it is not kind of way. Similar in a way that made people replay the clip 3, 4, 5 times just to be sure their own ears were not playing a trick on them, then send it to a sibling or a friend with a single message attached. Listen to this and tell me I am imagining it. Within days, that single hymn had been clipped, slowed down, and compared frame by frame against old Elvis recordings by people who had never even heard the name Bob Joyce a week earlier. If you remember exactly where you were the day you heard Elvis had died, you understand why a voice like this one hits differently for your generation than it does for anyone younger. That kind of memory does not fade. It just waits quietly for something to wake it back up. Joyce did not ask for any of this attention. He runs a modest website where longtime members of his congregation can watch recorded sermons and performances, the kind of low-key online presence you would expect from a working pastor, not someone chasing fame or trying to attach himself to a famous name. He was a small-town pastor doing what he had done for years, singing gospel to a room full of people who already knew him personally, most of whom had heard him sing that same hymn 100 times before, without a single person reaching for their phone. What he could not control was what happened once that room stopped being the only audience listening, and once strangers who had never set foot in Benton, Arkansas, started showing up in his church parking lot just to see him in person. By the time Bob Joyce realized what was happening, his voice no longer belonged only to his congregation. It belonged to a theory that was about to take on a life of its own. The theory that refused to die. The idea that Elvis Presley never really died has followed his legacy since the very day the world was told he had. For almost 5 decades, sightings, whispered rumors, and half-believed theories have circulated among fans who simply could not accept that a voice that enormous could disappear that suddenly in a bathroom on an ordinary August afternoon. Most of those older theories quietly faded after a few years of speculation and no real evidence to keep them alive, remembered mostly by dedicated fan clubs and the occasional late-night radio caller who still swore they had seen him at a gas station somewhere in the Midwest. What made the Bob Joyce version different was timing. It arrived at the exact moment short video platforms had trained an entire generation to trust a 15-second clip more than an official record from 1977. Fan accounts dedicated almost entirely to comparing Joyce and Presley began appearing, some gathering tens of thousands of followers who genuinely believed they were watching a piece of history quietly correct itself in real time. People pointed to his cheekbones, the way he held a microphone with both hands during a slow verse, the particular curl in his upper lip when he hit a high note, and even the small pause he tends to take right before the final chorus, the same kind of pause fans spent decades studying in old concert footage. Longtime fans who had followed Presley's career since they were teenagers weighed in with a certainty that surprised even the skeptics in the comment sections, insisting that decades spent watching someone perform gives you an instinct that strangers and algorithms simply do not have. Threads on discussion forums stretched into hundreds of replies, with longtime fans debating vocal timbre and stage mannerisms, the way some people debate sports statistics, treating every new clip as fresh evidence in a case that never actually went to trial. Individual videos began pulling in view counts that dwarfed anything Bob Joyce's small church page had ever seen before the theory took hold. For a certain corner of the internet, believing Bob Joyce was Elvis in hiding stopped being a fun theory to pass around. It became something closer to faith. And faith, once it settles into a person, is a difficult thing to argue them out of with facts alone. But faith and facts do not always agree with each other. And the moment someone finally sat down to check the actual numbers, this story ran straight into a problem nobody in the comment sections wanted to talk about. The numbers nobody wanted to run. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977.
Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing.
A fact confirmed at the time by his personal physician, his family, and multiple independent medical reports that have never been credibly disputed since. If he had somehow survived that day and were alive today, he would be 91 years old, a man well into his 10th decade of life. Bob Joyce, by contrast, has been reported in different places as being born in 1954 and elsewhere as being born in 1966, two very different numbers that cannot both be true, and neither of which comes anywhere close to matching a man who would now be pushing 92. Even setting aside the fact that Joyce's own birth year cannot seem to get reported consistently, the gap between his real age and the age Elvis would be today is not small enough to explain away with a clever disguise or a well-timed disappearance from public life. Voice resemblance is a real and well-documented phenomenon. Human vocal cords, shaped by genetics, upbringing, region, and years spent singing in church choirs, can land two completely unrelated men in a strikingly similar register more often than most people realize. And it happens without either man ever once meeting the other. Southern gospel singers in particular tend to share a similar phrasing and breath control simply because they were trained inside the same musical tradition, learning from the same hymnals in churches not far apart from one another, which makes a certain amount of vocal overlap almost expected rather than mysterious. For a theory built almost entirely on sound and a passing resemblance, the math should have mattered more than it ultimately did. What some clips did claim, without ever offering real proof, was that Joyce had refused to take a DNA test to settle the matter once and for all. As though a private citizen owes strangers on the internet his genetic information simply because his voice reminded them of someone famous. Instead, thousands of people kept sharing the same comparison videos anyway, because a compelling coincidence will always travel faster online than a boring correction ever could, no matter how many times someone posts the actual dates in the replies. The math never managed to stop the theory, and that same willingness to believe first and check later is exactly what set the stage for what happened next. Elvis's real granddaughter enters the story. Riley Keough is not a peripheral figure in any of this. She is the eldest daughter of Lisa Marie Presley and the eldest grandchild Elvis Presley ever had, which means her name carries real weight the second it gets attached to anything involving her grandfather's legacy. She built her own acting career largely on her own terms, often choosing roles that had little to do with her family name and everything to do with proving she could stand on her own. People who have followed the Presley family closely over the years have described them as protective of Elvis's story in a very particular way, careful about which parts of his life get shared publicly and which stay firmly inside the family. That instinct did not come from nowhere. This is a family that has already buried Riley's mother and her younger brother within the last several years, and grief on that scale tends to make people hold what remains of their privacy even tighter, not looser. That context matters here, because it is exactly what allowed the claim about Riley Keough and Bob Joyce to spread as fast and as far as it did. According to the posts that circulated earlier this year, Keough was said to have encountered Joyce in person, reacted with visible, unguarded emotion, and even sung alongside him before the moment reportedly ended with her saying something quiet about her grandfather that left everyone nearby in stunned silence. The story painted a picture of a woman finally confronting a piece of family history she had supposedly carried quietly for years, alone, unable to say it out loud until that exact moment, as though decades of restraint had simply broken open the second she stood in front of him. It read less like a gossip post and more like the opening scene of a documentary, complete with the kind of emotional beat that makes you want to see the rest of the footage immediately. If you have ever lost someone and then watched a stranger online claim to know exactly how you grieved them in private, or say something about that grief that was never actually theirs to say, you already understand why a story like this one lands so hard, whether or not a single word of it turns out to be accurate. That is exactly why so many people believed it without stopping to ask a much simpler question first, which was where this story had actually come from in the first place. That single question, the one about where this story actually originated, turns out to unravel almost everything else about it. Following the story back to its source. When you try to trace this story back to an original, verifiable source, something strange starts to happen very quickly. There is no interview anywhere. There is no verified footage of the actual encounter, only second-hand descriptions of one. There is no statement from Riley Keough, from anyone representing her, or from anyone connected to the Presley family, confirming that any of this took place. What you find instead is a small network of pages, most of them without a named author or any real editorial presence, publishing nearly identical headlines built around phrases like "the world stops breathing" and "the whole world falls silent." The same accounts posting this particular story about Riley Keough and Bob Joyce were, within that very same week, posting equally dramatic headlines about entirely unrelated celebrities, using the exact same emotional formula each time, right down to the punctuation. Look closely enough, and you start noticing the same recycled stock photography, the same generic profile pictures with no real history behind them, and comment sections that seem to reset every few weeks, as though the page had simply started over under a slightly different name. That pattern is not a coincidence, and once you notice it, you cannot really unsee it. It is a business model. Stories built around grief, nostalgia, and impossible reunions perform extremely well with audiences who miss the cultural figures they grew up watching. And pages that specialize in this kind of content know precisely which emotional buttons to press to keep people sharing before they think twice. They do not need the story to be true. They only need it to move fast enough that questions arrive too late to matter. Every share, every comment, and every outraged reaction generates advertising revenue for someone sitting far away from Arkansas and even farther from the Presley family. And that revenue does not care whether the underlying story is true. It only cares that you stayed on the page long enough for an advertisement to load. And once you realize that, it becomes clear your own attention was the actual product being sold the entire time. For a claim this dramatic, involving a real family that has spent decades quietly protecting its own privacy, the complete absence of any actual named source should have been the first thing anyone noticed, long before it reached your screen. Once that pattern becomes visible, it is genuinely hard to unsee, and it changes the way this entire story looks all the way back to the beginning. What was actually true the whole time? So what is actually true here? Bob Joyce is a real pastor who continues to preach most Sundays in Arkansas, still singing the same gospel songs that first caught the internet's attention, and still firmly denying every single time he is asked directly that he is Elvis Presley, living out a second life in disguise. Riley Keough continues her acting career and her own private life, and there is no confirmed record from her or from anyone around her that the meeting described online ever actually took place, let alone that she said the words that were attributed to her afterward. What genuinely happened here is quieter than the viral version, and in its own way, far more interesting. A man with a striking, resonant voice, doing nothing more unusual than singing in his own church, became the center of a decades-old fantasy that Elvis never really left us at all. A fantasy that had been quietly waiting for a new face to attach itself to. Then, almost inevitably, that fantasy grew large enough to reach for the one name that could make the story impossible for anyone to scroll past, Elvis's own granddaughter, whether she had anything to do with any of it or not.
Elvis, your grandfather.
Yes.
And tell us, what was your review? How do you think he did?
I mean, I think he was outstanding and incredible, and I couldn't have imagined.
It says something honest about all of us, that a story like this can travel around the entire world before the truth has even had a chance to get its shoes on. We want our legends to still be out there somewhere, alive, singing quietly in a small church, simply waiting to be recognized by someone who finally looks closely enough. That longing is real, and it says something tender about how deeply Elvis mattered to the people who grew up with his voice in their kitchens and their car radios, playing while dinner was being made, while a father got ready for work on an ordinary morning that felt, at the time, like it would never end. But the longing being real does not make the story built on top of it true. And Bob Joyce, whatever you make of his voice, deserves to be seen as a working pastor rather than a costume someone else wrote for him. Riley Keough deserves the same basic fairness, the right to not have words placed in her mouth about the most private parts of her family, simply because it made for a better headline than the truth would have. The next time a headline promises you a moment that stunned everyone, it is worth pausing just long enough to ask who actually benefits from you believing it before you have had the chance to check. Tell us in the comments if you had already heard this claim before it reached you here today. Let us know which Elvis mystery you think deserves a closer, honest look next.